I never thought my evening walk home would put me in the crosshairs of organized predators. I was 28, teaching 3rd grade at Millerville Elementary in our small Montana town, population just under 4,000 people. The kind of place where parents still let their children ride bicycles after dark and where the biggest crime of the year was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower. My life was simple but fulfilling, teaching bright 8-year-olds during the day and hiking the mountain trails that surrounded our valley on weekends. That particular Friday evening in late August, I had met my friend Brianna at Murphy's Diner for our monthly dinner, something we had been doing since we both moved to Millerville 3 years earlier. She worked as a park ranger at the state recreation area, and I always enjoyed hearing her stories about wildlife encounters and the tourists who thought they could hike 15 miles in sandals. The diner sat on Main Street, only about a 15-minute walk from my rental house on Oakwood Drive. I always enjoyed the stroll home, especially on warm summer nights when the air smelled like pine and the mountains created dramatic silhouettes against the darkening sky. Around 9:30 p.m., I hugged Brianna goodbye in the parking lot and started my walk home along Hillcrest Road. The street was poorly lit, just a few street lamps every couple hundred feet. But I had walked this route countless times and knew every pothole and crack in the sidewalk. The Hendersons' golden retriever would usually bark from behind their fence when I passed. Mrs. Foster's wind chimes would tinkle in her front yard, and old Mr. Peterson would often be sitting on his porch, raising a hand in greeting. That night, though, most houses were already dark, their occupants probably watching television or getting ready for bed. I remember feeling completely at peace, thinking about the lesson plans I needed to finish that weekend, humming some tune I had heard on the radio earlier. The air was still warm but carried that hint of approaching fall. And I was wearing my favorite sundress, the yellow one with tiny flowers that my mother had given me for my birthday. I was about halfway home, passing the stretch where Hillcrest curves slightly near the old oak tree that everyone calls the wishing tree because kids have been tying ribbons to it for decades. The sidewalk ended there, so I had to walk on the shoulder of the road, but there was usually so little traffic at that hour that it never bothered me. That is when I heard the engine. Not the steady hum of a car maintaining speed, but this aggressive, uneven roaring that kept surging and dropping like someone was randomly stomping on the gas pedal. I turned my head to look back and saw headlights weaving across both lanes about 200 yards away, moving way too fast for this narrow road. The vehicle, a dark pickup truck based on the height of the lights, kept drifting from one side to the other, tires squealing every time it corrected too hard. My first thought was not even about my own safety. I actually worried the driver might hit the wishing tree, which sounds ridiculous now. But that tree had been a landmark in our community for generations. But then I realized the truck was accelerating, really gunning it on this straight stretch, and it was veering toward my side of the road. The headlights swung wide to the left, then overcorrected sharply to the right, heading straight for the shoulder where I was walking. Everything happened in maybe 3 seconds, but my brain recorded it in this strange, stretched-out way. I tried to jump toward the drainage ditch, but my sandal caught on a piece of loose gravel and I stumbled. The truck was so close I could see the bugs splattered on the grill, could smell the hot engine and burnt rubber. The driver, I glimpsed his face for just an instant through the windshield, had this slack, unfocused expression, his mouth hanging open, one hand loosely on the wheel while the other held what looked like a beer bottle. His eyes were not even looking at the road. They were glazed, staring at nothing, but there was something calculated about his positioning that made my blood freeze even in that split second of terror. This was not just drunk driving. This was deliberate. The impact came from behind and to my left, the truck's front bumper catching me at hip level and launching me forward like I weighed nothing. I remember the sensation of flying, my dress billowing up, one sandal flying off, and thinking absurdly that I needed to cover myself, that people might see my underwear. Then I hit the pavement hard, my right shoulder taking the initial impact before I rolled and skidded across the asphalt. The pain did not register immediately. There was just this overwhelming wrongness, like my body had become a jumbled puzzle with pieces forced into the wrong spots. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel wetness spreading across the right side of my face. The truck had not stopped. I heard it screech around the next curve, metal scraping against something, probably the guardrail, before the engine noise faded into the distance. I tried to move to get up, but my right leg would not respond at all. When I looked down, I saw it was bent at an angle that made no anatomical sense, my foot facing completely backward. My right arm was trapped underneath me, and when I tried to pull it free, white-hot agony shot through my shoulder and chest. I could hear myself making these awful whimpering sounds like a wounded animal, but I could not stop. The yellow sundress my mother had given me was torn and soaking up blood from a dozen different places, the tiny flowers disappearing under spreading red stains. I lay there on the warm asphalt, feeling it burning against my exposed skin, trying to call for help, but only managing these raspy whispers. My phone had been in my purse, which was now scattered somewhere in the darkness. I could see my wallet about 10 feet away, my driver's license facing up, and somehow that detail felt important, like I needed people to know who I was when they found me. The first car to arrive was driven by Anthony, a local farmer who had been coming home late from checking on his cattle. He found me around 10:15 p.m. and immediately called for an ambulance while covering me with a blanket from his truck. "Do not try to move," he kept saying, though moving was the last thing my body wanted to do anyway. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, a response time that probably saved my life given the internal injuries I had sustained. They stabilized me on scene before transporting me to the regional hospital in Billings. A 40-minute helicopter ride that I barely remember except for the steady thrum of rotors and someone holding my hand. The next few days were a haze of surgeries and pain medication, but one conversation stands out with crystal clarity. Detective Benjamin Walsh from the state police came to interview me while I was still in intensive care, asking detailed questions about the truck, the driver, and whether I had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the incident. "This was not random," Detective Walsh explained during our second meeting. "We have been tracking a pattern of similar incidents across 3 states. Young women, usually teachers or healthcare workers, walking alone in small mountain communities. The profile is very specific, and the targeting appears to be deliberate. The investigation revealed that my attack was part of a coordinated operation involving at least 4 men, who had been systematically targeting isolated women in small towns throughout Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. They would scout communities for weeks, identifying women who walked alone at predictable times, learning their routines, and planning attacks that appeared to be drunk driving accidents. The truck that hit me had been stolen from a ranch outside Missoula 2 days earlier. The driver, whose name was Ryan Marcus, had a lengthy criminal record including assault and trafficking charges. But most terrifyingly, they found detailed files in his hotel room containing photographs of me taken over several weeks, including images of my classroom, my house, and my regular walking route. Ryan and his accomplices had been in Millerville for over a month, posing as seasonal construction workers while gathering intelligence on potential victims. They had targeted me specifically because my evening walks were predictable and because the stretch of Hillcrest Road near the wishing tree provided the perfect location for an attack that could be dismissed as a drunk driving accident. The FBI arrested the entire network 6 weeks after my attack, preventing what investigators believe would have been escalating violence against women throughout the region. Ryan received 25 years in federal prison. His accomplices got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation. revealing a trafficking operation that had been using small towns as hunting grounds for victims who could be easily isolated and transported. I spent 4 months in physical therapy learning to walk again with a permanently damaged right leg and ongoing nerve damage in my shoulder. The school district held my position, and my students made cards that covered every wall of my hospital room. But I knew I could not return to Millerville. The idea of walking those streets again, of passing the wishing tree where my life had nearly ended, was more than I could psychologically handle. I moved to Seattle 6 months after the attack, taking a teaching position in a large urban school where anonymity felt like protection, and where I could take public transportation instead of walking alone. The transition was difficult, leaving behind the mountain community that had felt like home, but necessary for my mental health and long-term recovery. Brianna still sends updates about Millerville, always careful to avoid mentioning Hillcrest Road or the Wishing Tree. The town installed better lighting throughout the residential areas and organized neighborhood watch programs. But the sense of safety that had defined life there was permanently altered by the knowledge that predators had been living among them for weeks. I know now that small towns are not inherently safer than cities, just more isolated and therefore more vulnerable to organized predators who understand how to exploit trust and routine. My evening walk, which had been a simple pleasure for 3 years, was actually a carefully observed pattern that nearly cost me my life. The investigation also revealed something that still gives me nightmares. The network had been planning to escalate beyond hit-and-run attacks. In Ryan's notes, agents found detailed plans for abductions, including a timeline that suggested I had less than a week before they moved from surveillance to direct action. My attack was actually the beginning of their exit strategy, not the culmination of their plan. Most people can walk home from dinner without calculating escape routes or wondering if the vehicles behind them pose a threat. But I learned that some predators study their victims with the patience of scientists, learning routines and vulnerabilities before striking with precision that makes their crimes appear random when they are actually the result of weeks of careful planning. I never thought my neighbor's farm equipment business would be connected to murder. I was 45, working as an insurance adjuster in Millerville, a small farming community of 3,800 people in central Kansas, where everybody knew everybody's business and nothing exciting ever happened. The kind of place where the biggest news of the week was usually someone's prize steer getting loose or the high school football team making it to regionals. My wife Nicole and I had lived there for 15 years, and Justin lived 3 houses down from us for most of that time. Justin was the kind of neighbor you could count on for anything. When the tornado took out half our garage in 2019, he was there the next morning with his tools and lumber, working alongside me to rebuild it without being asked. When Nicole was in the hospital for her emergency appendectomy, Justin brought casseroles for a week and never mentioned the cost or trouble. He was at our wedding anniversary party, our 4th of July barbecues, and every single one of our Christmas Eve gatherings since we moved to Millerville. His farm equipment leasing company seemed like the natural evolution of someone who had grown up around machinery and understood what local farmers needed. Justin had taken over his father's old auto repair shop on Highway 36 and transformed it into something bigger, more modern, catering to the agricultural community that formed the backbone of our local economy. Tractors, combines, irrigation systems, everything a modern farming operation required but might not be able to afford outright. So when Justin approached me at Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday in September, sliding into the booth across from me with that familiar grin, I had absolutely no reason to be suspicious. "I've got a business proposition for you," he said, ordering coffee from Diane behind the counter, who had been serving the same route for 20 years. "Something that could help both of us out financially." The pitch was straightforward and appealing. Justin's equipment leasing business was expanding rapidly, but he needed capital to purchase more inventory to meet demand. He was offering investment opportunities to select local people, promising returns of 15% annually on investments of $10,000 or more. "I'd rather work with people I trust than go to some bank in Topeka that doesn't understand agriculture," he explained. The numbers made sense based on what I knew about farming and equipment costs. 15% was higher than anything we could get from CDs or savings accounts, but not so high that it seemed unrealistic given the margins in agricultural equipment. Justin showed me spreadsheets on his laptop, detailed projections for growth, testimonials from farmers who were already leasing equipment and expanding their operations thanks to his financing options. "I've already got commitments from Benjamin, Ryan, and Alexander," he mentioned, naming 3 other neighbors, whose financial judgment I respected. "We're keeping this local, people who understand the community and want to see it prosper." The idea of being part of something that would strengthen Millerville's economy while providing financial security for Nicole and me was exactly the kind of opportunity we had been hoping to find. Nicole and I discussed it over dinner that night, weighing the pros and cons while our 15-year-old son Anthony did homework at the kitchen table. The investment would represent most of our savings, the money we had been accumulating for Anthony's college education and our own retirement. But 15% returns would actually accelerate those goals significantly if Justin's projections proved accurate. We decided to invest $12,000, essentially our entire emergency fund plus the money earmarked for a new roof. Justin came to our house the following Saturday evening to finalize the paperwork, bringing contracts that looked professional and legitimate, complete with legal language about terms, conditions, and responsibilities. Nicole signed as co-investor, and we shook hands on what felt like the beginning of financial security for our family. The first quarterly payment arrived exactly on schedule in December, a check for $450 that represented our share of the profits from Justin's expanding business. The second payment came in March, right on time, and Justin even included a handwritten note thanking us for our confidence and updating us on recent equipment purchases and lease agreements with farms throughout the county. But the June payment never arrived. When I called Justin's office, his secretary Kayla said he was out of town visiting equipment suppliers and would return my call within the week. The week stretched into 2 weeks, then 3, and my calls were increasingly met with evasive responses about Justin being busy with major deals that required his immediate attention. I drove past Justin's property on Highway 36 one Thursday evening in July and noticed that the lot, which had been full of tractors and combines just months earlier, was completely empty. The building looked abandoned, windows dark. No vehicles in the parking area that had always been bustling with farmers and mechanics during business hours. A for lease sign was posted near the road, something that made my stomach clench with the first real understanding that our investment might be in serious trouble. The next morning, I went to the county courthouse to research property records, hoping to find information about Justin's business operations or perhaps a forwarding address. What I discovered was far worse than simple business failure. The building on Highway 36 had been sold 3 months earlier to a development company from Wichita. Justin no longer owned any property in Millerville, and according to the clerk, he had not filed any business licenses or tax documents for his equipment leasing company in over a year. I called Benjamin, Ryan, and Alexander, the other neighbors Justin had mentioned as investors. None of them had invested any money. In fact, Ryan had never even been approached about the investment opportunity, and Alexander said Justin had only mentioned it in passing without providing any details or paperwork. The testimonials and commitments Justin had described were complete fabrications designed to make me feel confident about investing. Nicole took the news about our financial loss with the kind of quiet devastation that was worse than anger or tears. We had trusted someone we had known for 15 years, someone who had eaten at our table and helped us through difficult times. The betrayal felt more personal and more painful than simple fraud, because it destroyed our faith in the community relationships that had defined our lives in Millerville. But the story became infinitely more horrifying when the FBI arrived in town 6 weeks later. Special Agent Sarah Chen knocked on our door on a Tuesday morning in August, asking questions about our financial relationship with Justin and whether we had noticed anything unusual about his business operations or personal behavior. The questions seemed routine until she asked whether we had visited any of the properties Justin claimed to own or lease for equipment storage. Agent Chen explained that Justin was suspected of running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors across 3 states of over $2 million. But the investigation had uncovered something much darker than financial fraud. Several of the properties Justin claimed to own for equipment storage were actually sites where human remains had been discovered, and he was now considered a suspect in multiple homicides dating back several years. The farmhouse 40 miles outside Millerville, where Justin had supposedly stored combines and irrigation equipment, was actually a burial ground for at least 5 people who had been reported missing from small farming communities across Kansas and Nebraska. The FBI had found skeletal remains, personal belongings, and evidence suggesting the victims had been killed execution-style before being buried in hastily dug graves behind the abandoned barn. Agent Chen showed me photographs of the victims, asking whether I recognized any of them or whether Justin had ever mentioned knowing people from outside Millerville. The faces were unfamiliar, but the ages and backgrounds were chillingly similar. All were middle-aged residents of small towns. All had reported missing persons cases that had gone cold within weeks, and all had last been seen meeting with someone about investment opportunities or business deals. The investigation revealed that Justin's equipment leasing company had never actually owned any equipment. The tractors and combines I had seen on his lot were either stolen or temporarily borrowed from legitimate dealers for the purpose of maintaining his cover story. The farmers who had supposedly provided testimonials about his services were either fictional or had been coerced into providing false statements through threats or intimidation. Most terrifyingly, the FBI discovered that Justin had been using investor meetings to identify potential victims for something much worse than financial fraud. Agent Chen explained that several of the murder victims had initially been approached about investment opportunities, just as I had been. The difference was that they had apparently asked too many questions, demanded too much documentation, or threatened to expose his fraudulent operations. "You were lucky," Agent Chen told me during our second interview. Based on the pattern we've identified, investors who became suspicious or demanding usually disappeared within weeks of making those concerns known. Your decision to research the property records probably saved your life because it meant you discovered the fraud through your own investigation rather than confronting Justin directly. The arrest happened at a truck stop outside Oklahoma City, where Justin had been living under a false identity and apparently scouting for new victims among the farming communities of the Southern Plains. In his possession, authorities found detailed files on dozens of potential investors, including maps to secluded properties and what appeared to be plans for disposing of bodies in various rural locations. Justin confessed to 6 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though the FBI believes the actual number of victims is much higher. He received 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released from federal prison. The $2 million he had stolen from investors was never recovered, apparently spent on maintaining multiple identities and purchasing the tools and vehicles necessary for his killing spree. Nicole and I lost our life savings, but we gained something that felt even more valuable: the knowledge that we had survived an encounter with a serial killer who had been using financial fraud as a cover for murder. The investigation revealed that Anthony had actually been in danger too, because Justin had been asking neighbors about our family routines and whether our son walked home alone from school. The farmhouse where the bodies were found was eventually demolished after the FBI completed their forensic work, but the land remains undeveloped, marked only by a small memorial that lists the names of the confirmed victims. Local farmers still avoid the area, and the access road has been permanently closed by the county, creating a kind of dead zone in the landscape that serves as a constant reminder of the evil that had been operating among us. We moved to Colorado 6 months after Justin's arrest, unable to continue living in a community where we questioned every neighbor's motives and wondered what other secrets might be hidden behind friendly facades. The house in Millerville sold quickly but at a significant loss, as news of the murders had affected property values throughout the area. Nicole found work at a veterinary clinic in Fort Collins, and I transferred to a regional insurance office where no one knew about our experience with Justin or the investment scheme that had almost cost us everything. Anthony adapted to his new school with the resilience of teenagers, though he still has nightmares about the man who helped rebuild our garage and brought casseroles when his mother was sick. I know now that predators can spend years building trust and establishing credibility before revealing their true intentions. Justin had been patient, methodical, creating the perfect cover story for financial fraud while simultaneously identifying potential victims for murder. The investment opportunity was never about money. It was about finding isolated, trusting people who could be eliminated without triggering immediate suspicion. Most people invest with friends and neighbors because they trust the relationships they have built over years of shared experiences. But I learned that some people cultivate those relationships specifically to create opportunities for exploitation and violence. And sometimes the neighbor who helps you rebuild after a tornado is actually a serial killer who has been planning to bury you in an abandoned farmhouse since the day he moved to your street. The thing that haunts me most is remembering how natural and convincing Justin was during every interaction we had over those 15 years. There were no warning signs, no moments where his mask slipped, no behaviors that suggested he was anything other than the helpful neighbor we believed him to be. He attended church every Sunday, coached Little League baseball, and volunteered at the annual corn festival with the same enthusiasm as everyone else in our community. I never thought owning an auto repair shop would put me in a serial killer's crosshairs. I was 32, managing the family business in our small Nebraska town of 4,200 people. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where cars were left unlocked and kids walked to school without parents worrying. My wife Nicole and I had just bought our first house 3 blocks from Main Street, and life was moving along exactly as we had planned it. Quiet, predictable, safe. I had been pulling 12-hour days trying to get the shop ready for winter. That particular evening in late October, I had stayed until almost 11 p.m. working on Mrs. Henderson's old Buick because she needed it for her doctor's appointment the next morning. The only gas station open that late was the Shell on Route 47, about 3 miles outside town where the streetlights ended and the cornfields began. I knew the night clerk Ryan, a kid fresh out of high school who always had his earbuds in and a Monster Energy drink sweating on the counter. My truck's fuel light had been glaring at me for the last 5 miles, and I figured I would grab a coffee too. Maybe one of those packaged sandwiches that had been sitting under the heat lamp since noon. The parking lot was empty except for a beat-up Chevy Silverado parked crooked near the dumpster, rust eating through the wheel wells and one headlight dimmer than the other. I pulled up to pump number 2, killed the engine, and stepped out into the kind of cold that makes your nose hair stiffen instantly. As I was unscrewing my gas cap, I noticed movement near the store entrance. 2 guys I had never seen before, both wearing dark hoodies. One was tall and lanky, maybe 6'3", with nervous energy that had him shifting his weight like a boxer warming up. The other was shorter, stockier, with a thick beard and hands shoved deep in his pockets. They were standing too close to Ryan, who had backed up against the cigarette display, his usual bored expression replaced with fear. I had already started pumping gas when I heard the first shout through the glass doors. The taller one had grabbed Ryan by the collar, lifting him off his feet, while the bearded one was behind the counter yanking at the cash register. I could see Ryan's mouth moving, probably explaining that he could not open the safe, that he did not have the combination. My first instinct was to get in my truck and drive away, call 911 from a safe distance. But then I saw the tall one pull something from his waistband. Even from 30 feet away through glass and bad lighting, I knew exactly what that dark metal shape was. And Ryan was just a kid, probably making minimum wage, definitely not getting paid enough to have a gun pointed at his temple. I left the pump running and started walking toward the store, my work boots crunching on loose gravel. I pulled out my phone, trying to look casual while dialing 911, but my fingers were numb from cold and adrenaline. The dispatcher answered just as I reached for the door handle, and I managed to whisper the address and robbery in progress before sliding the phone into my jacket pocket. The bell above the door chimed when I walked in, that cheerful electronic ding completely wrong for what was happening. Both men spun toward me with sharp predatory awareness. The tall one kept his gun on Ryan but shifted his body to face me. I could see his eyes now. Pale blue, bloodshot, pupils blown wide from what was probably methamphetamine. "Just getting coffee," I said, raising my hand slightly, trying to sound like I had not noticed anything unusual. The tall one studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably 3 seconds, his jaw working like he was chewing invisible gum. That gun hand trembling just enough to make me worry about an accidental trigger pull. That is when I noticed the tall one had moved closer to me, close enough that I could smell him. Stale sweat, cigarettes, and something chemical that burned my nostrils. "You are that mechanic guy," he said, and my whole body went rigid because being recognized meant this was about to get much worse than a simple robbery. "Fixed my cousin's Honda last month." His voice was raspy, like he had been screaming for hours. "Charged him $400 for an alternator." The gun was pointing at me now, wavering between my chest and my face. "That alternator failed already. My cousin had to miss work, lost his job, lost his apartment. That's on you." The logic was completely insane, but arguing with an armed drug addict about warranty policies seemed like a quick way to end up on the evening news. The bearded one was getting agitated, kept saying a name that sounded like Benjamin, and pulling at his partner's sleeve while glancing toward the door. Everything shifted in a matter of seconds. Sirens in the distance, faint but getting louder. Both men heard them at the same time I did. The bearded one bolted for the door immediately, bags clutched against his chest, knocking over a display of windshield wiper fluid that exploded across the floor in blue puddles. But the tall one did not run. Instead, his face went from angry to something else entirely, something blank and decided. "You did this," he said to me, and I knew what was coming before his arm extended fully, before his stance widened, before that finger stopped trembling and became steady with murderous purpose. I threw myself sideways toward the chip aisle, but I was 32 with bad knees from high school football. The first shot caught me in the lower back, right above my belt line, spinning me into the metal shelving. The second shot hit somewhere near my spine as I was falling, and then I could not feel my legs anymore. Just this strange absence where sensation should have been. The linoleum was cold against my cheek, and I could see under the shelves to where Ryan was crawling toward the back exit, leaving bloody handprints in the spreading pool of, blue washer fluid. The tall shooter stood over me for a moment, looking confused, like he had not expected it to be this easy or this awful to shoot an unarmed man. I tried to move, tried to crawl toward help, but below my waist was just nothing. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel something warm spreading under me, soaking through my work shirt, pooling faster than seemed possible. My phone was still in my pocket, the dispatcher probably still on the line. The cops arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably under 2 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the store like lighthouse beams. An officer with a mustache knelt beside me, pressing something against my back while talking into his radio using codes I did not understand, but that sounded urgent. The paramedics came next, asking me questions I could not answer, telling me to stay awake when all I wanted was to close my eyes. One of them, a woman with a septum piercing who looked too young to be saving lives, held my hand while they got me on the backboard, saying I was doing great, that I was so strong. The next few months were a haze of surgeries, medical terms I could not pronounce, and learning that incomplete spinal injury meant I would probably never walk normally again. They caught both men 3 days later at a motel 40 miles north. The tall one was named Benjamin Garrett. The bearded one was named Alexander Walsh. Names that became permanent residents in my head, taking up space that should have been occupied by better memories. Benjamin got 25 to life. Alexander got 15 years. Numbers that seemed both too much and not enough for what they had taken from me and my family. Nicole had to sell the shop because we needed the money for medical bills and house modifications. Ramps, grab bars, a hospital bed that made our bedroom look like a care facility instead of the intimate space where we had planned our future together. The town rallied around us with fundraisers at the VFW hall and meal trains that lasted months. But there is a special kind of loneliness in being the guy everyone feels sorry for, in going from fixing cars with your hands to barely being able to hold a wrench steady. I still have dreams where I can run, where my legs work, where I make different choices that night. Maybe I just drive away. Maybe I do not stop for gas at all. But every morning I wake up to the same reality. A wheelchair beside the bed, Nicole's forced smile that does not quite reach her eyes anymore, and the knowledge that one Thursday night at a gas station changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought our little town was too small for this kind of violence. Most people can walk into a convenience store without calculating exit routes, or wondering if the other customers might be armed. But I know now that evil does not respect small-town boundaries, that it can drive up in a rusty Silverado and destroy everything you have built in the space between two gunshots. I never thought my environmental testing job would uncover a decades-old murder conspiracy. I was 35, working as a state environmental inspector in Millerville, Colorado, a former mining town of 2,400 people tucked into a valley where the Rocky Mountains created natural barriers that kept the outside world at arm's length. The kind of place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew each other's business, and where the biggest employer had always been the copper mine until it closed in 1987. My job involved testing soil and water samples throughout the region, ensuring that old industrial sites met current environmental standards before new development could proceed. It was routine work that rarely involved anything more exciting than elevated lead levels or contaminated groundwater from abandoned gas stations. I had been doing similar inspections for 8 years, and Millerville was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. The Blackwater copper mine had been sealed for over 30 years following what official records described as a structural collapse that killed 3 workers. The mine entrance was blocked with concrete barriers, warning signs posted throughout the area, and the entire site was surrounded by chain-link fencing that had rusted but remained intact. My assignment was to assess soil contamination levels in preparation for a housing development planned for the surrounding acreage. Benjamin Walsh, the current sheriff, met me at the site on a Tuesday morning in October, explaining the history of the mine and the 1987 accident that led to its closure. tragic business," he said, unlocking the gate that led to the testing area. "3 good men lost their lives when the main tunnel collapsed. The company sealed everything up rather than risk more casualties trying to recover the bodies." Sheriff Walsh seemed genuinely helpful, providing historical documents and maps that showed the mine's layout and the areas where I needed to collect samples. He even offered to accompany me during my initial site survey, though I assured him that would not be necessary. The testing process would take several days, and I preferred to work alone when collecting samples that required precise documentation. The first day's soil samples showed elevated copper levels, which was expected given the site's history, but nothing that would prevent development with proper remediation. I worked methodically, collecting samples in a grid pattern that extended from the sealed mine entrance toward the area where houses would eventually be built. It was on the second day that I discovered the anomaly. While testing soil near what the maps indicated was a ventilation shaft, my metal detector registered something large buried about 4 feet below the surface. The readings suggested metal objects much larger than the typical debris you would find around an old mining operation. I excavated carefully, following proper protocols for potentially hazardous materials, and uncovered what appeared to be a vehicle bumper. Further excavation revealed an entire pickup truck, a late 1980s Ford, buried deliberately and covered with a layer of mine tailings that had concealed it for decades. The truck's license plate was still attached, though corroded. I photographed everything before carefully brushing away enough dirt to read the numbers. A quick check of state records revealed that the vehicle had been registered to Marcus Thompson, reported missing in 1989 along with his wife Catherine and their teenage daughter Jessica. The Thompson family disappearance had been one of the region's most notorious unsolved cases. They had last been seen leaving their home in neighboring Riverside County, supposedly heading to California for a family vacation. Their house was found empty, mail piling up, but no evidence of foul play. The case had eventually gone cold, and most people assumed they had started new lives somewhere else. Finding their truck buried at the mine site changed everything. I immediately called the state police, and within hours the area was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and equipment for a full-scale excavation. Sheriff Walsh arrived shortly after the state police, and I noticed his demeanor had changed completely from our friendly interaction the previous day. Detective Sarah Chen from the state police took charge of the investigation, establishing a perimeter around the burial site and beginning the painstaking process of excavating the truck and searching for additional evidence. The work required several days, during which time I continued my environmental testing in other areas while staying available to answer questions about my discovery. The truck contained skeletal remains of 3 individuals, later confirmed through dental records to be the Thompson family. But the forensic examination revealed details that transformed this from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. All 3 victims had suffered gunshot wounds to the head, and the truck showed evidence of being deliberately driven to this location before burial. Detective Chen interviewed me extensively about my discovery and the circumstances that led to finding the truck. During our conversation, she revealed information that made my blood run cold. The mine had not actually collapsed in 1987. According to geological surveys and mining company records she had obtained, the tunnels were structurally sound at the time of closure. The 3 workers who had supposedly died in the collapse were Marcus Thompson, Catherine Thompson, and their daughter Jessica. The official story about a mining accident had been fabricated to explain their disappearance and provide justification for sealing the mine site, preventing anyone from discovering their bodies. Further investigation revealed that Marcus Thompson had been a whistleblower, threatening to expose illegal dumping practices at the mine that violated federal environmental regulations. The mining company had been disposing of toxic waste in abandoned tunnels, saving millions of dollars in proper disposal costs while contaminating groundwater throughout the region. Marcus had documented these violations and planned to report them to federal authorities, which would have resulted in massive fines, criminal charges, and the mine's immediate closure. Instead of facing those consequences, someone had decided to eliminate the threat permanently. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of law enforcement and local government. Sheriff Walsh's predecessor, Ryan Martinez, had been directly involved in covering up the murders and creating the false narrative about the mining accident. Several county commissioners, mining company executives, and state inspectors had participated in the cover-up, ensuring that no investigation would uncover the truth. Detective Chen's investigation expanded rapidly, examining financial records, interviewing retired employees, and searching for additional evidence of corruption. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving millions of dollars in bribes, falsified environmental reports, and systematic intimidation of anyone who might have questioned the official story. But the most shocking revelation came when Detective Chen arrested Sheriff Walsh himself. He had not just inherited the cover-up from his predecessor. He had been actively maintaining it for over a decade. The helpful cooperation he had shown during my initial site visit was actually an attempt to monitor my activities and ensure I did not discover anything that would expose the truth. Analysis of the buried truck revealed that it had been moved to the mine site shortly after the murders, using mining equipment to dig the burial pit and cover it with tailings. The entire operation had been planned and executed with the resources and authority of both the mining company and local law enforcement. The environmental contamination I had been hired to assess was actually much worse than anyone had suspected. The illegal dumping that Marcus Thompson had tried to expose had continued for years after his murder, turning the entire mine site into a toxic waste repository that posed serious health risks to the surrounding community. Federal investigators eventually identified 17 people involved in the conspiracy, including mining executives, county officials, and law enforcement officers. Sheriff Walsh received a life sentence for his role in the murders and cover-up. The mining company faced billions of dollars in cleanup costs and criminal penalties. The housing development that prompted my environmental assessment was permanently canceled. The entire mine site was designated as a Superfund cleanup location, requiring decades of remediation work to address the contamination that had been hidden for so long. I transferred to a different region 6 months after testifying in the trials that resulted from my discovery. Living in Millerville had become impossible once the community learned that their trusted sheriff had been protecting murderers and that their local government had been systematically lying to them for over 30 years. The experience taught me that environmental contamination often reflects deeper forms of corruption, and that the earth itself can preserve evidence of crimes that human institutions work desperately to conceal. Sometimes the most routine investigation can uncover secrets that powerful people have spent decades hiding. Most environmental inspectors test soil for chemical contamination and file reports that few people ever read. But I learned that some of us occasionally discover burial grounds that expose the toxic relationships between money, power, and violence in communities that appear peaceful on the surface. The Blackwater mine site remains closed, surrounded by new fencing and warning signs that tell only part of the truth about what lies beneath the surface. The real memorial to Marcus, Catherine, and Jessica Thompson is not the small marker placed near the former mine entrance, but the environmental cleanup that finally addresses the contamination Marcus died trying to expose. I never thought joining a Facebook group would put me on a predator's hunting list. I was 28, fresh out of a messy divorce, starting over as the new veterinarian in Millbrook, Ohio. A small town of 8,000 people nestled between rolling farmland and suburban sprawl. The kind of place where people still waved at strangers on Main Street and left casseroles on your doorstep when you moved in. After 3 years of marriage counseling and legal fees in Columbus, Millbrook felt like a sanctuary where I could rebuild my life quietly and safely. The veterinary clinic on Maple Avenue was everything I had dreamed of during those long nights in veterinary school. A converted Victorian house with original hardwood floors, large windows that let in afternoon sunlight, and examination rooms that still had the charm of someone's former living spaces. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the retiring vet, had built a practice where farmers trusted her with their prize cattle and families brought their golden retrievers for routine checkups with equal confidence. My apartment was a small one-bedroom above the bakery on Main Street, close enough to walk to work but far enough from my ex-husband's lawyers and process servers. The smell of fresh bread every morning felt like a promise that life could be simple and good again. Nicole, the baker downstairs, always had coffee ready by 6 a.m. and never asked personal questions, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. Joining the Millbrook Community Board Facebook group seemed like the logical next step toward integration. A place to learn about local events, find recommendations for everything from plumbers to pizza, and maybe make connections with people who did not know about my failed marriage or the reasons it ended so badly. The group had 1,200 members, mostly longtime residents sharing updates about school board meetings and lost cats. My introduction post was simple enough. Hi everyone, I'm Megan, the new vet taking over Dr. Hendricks' practice. Looking forward to meeting you all and serving the Millbrook community. Any recommendations for the best coffee shop? Innocent? Professional? The kind of post that should have generated a few friendly replies about local businesses and maybe some questions about veterinary services. Instead, it generated immediate attention that felt slightly off balance. Within an hour, I had 17 comments. Most of them welcoming, but a few that lingered in my memory with uncomfortable specificity. Welcome to town, beautiful. You'll love it here if you know how to appreciate the finer things. Another. Hope you're settling in well. The Victorian apartments on Main Street are charming, but the locks are pretty old. Might want to upgrade for safety. The second comment bothered me enough that I walked downstairs to ask Nicole about building security. She assured me the front door lock had been upgraded recently and that Main Street was perfectly safe, but something in her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. Just keep your apartment door locked, she said, avoiding eye contact while wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Alexander Smith started private messaging me 3 days after my introduction post. His profile picture showed a pleasant-looking man in his early 40s, brown hair, kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt against what looked like a farm backdrop. His posts in the community group were always helpful, informative, the kind of content you would expect from a longtime resident who genuinely cared about his neighbors. Welcome to Millbrook, his first message read. I know starting over in a new place can be overwhelming. If you need any help navigating local services or just want someone to show you around, I'd be happy to help. I've lived here my whole life and know everyone worth knowing. Friendly, appropriate, the kind of offer I might have accepted from a neighbor in a different context. But Alexander's messages became more frequent and progressively more personal. He knew I was divorced before I had mentioned it publicly. He knew I worked late on Thursdays because the clinic stayed open for emergency calls. He knew I lived alone above the bakery, knew my apartment number, knew that I usually got home around 7 p.m. and that my bedroom faced the alley behind Main Street. I noticed your lights were on pretty late last night, one message read. Everything okay? It's not safe for a woman to be wandering around alone after dark in an unfamiliar place. There are people in this town who might take advantage of someone new, someone vulnerable. The concern felt manufactured, and the word vulnerable made my skin crawl with recognition. I stopped responding to Alexander's messages, but that did not stop them from arriving. 3 or 4 per day, each one revealing more intimate knowledge of my daily routine than any stranger should possess. He knew I bought groceries on Tuesday evenings at the IGA, knew I usually walked to work rather than driving, knew I had been asking around about hiking trails in the state park. The messages shifted from friendly offers to subtle warnings about other people in town. Be careful of the construction workers renovating the bank building. They've been asking about the new vet, specifically whether you live alone, and some of the guys at Murphy's bar have been talking about you. Nothing dangerous, but small-town gossip can get uncomfortable quickly. I started varying my routine, taking different routes to work, shopping at different times, staying late at the clinic to avoid walking home during predictable hours. But Alexander's messages suggested he was adapting to my changes faster than I was making them. Saw you took the back road home tonight. Smart choice. Oak Street has better lighting and more foot traffic. The veterinary clinic's security cameras captured something that made my blood freeze during my 3rd week in town. I had stayed late on a Thursday to monitor a golden retriever recovering from surgery, and around 10 p.m. I noticed movement in the parking lot. A figure standing near the back entrance, not quite close enough to trigger the motion lights, but positioned where he could watch both the clinic and my apartment windows across the street. The video quality was not perfect, but the height and build matched Alexander's profile pictures exactly. He stood there for 47 minutes according to the timestamp, occasionally checking his phone, never moving far enough from the shadows to be clearly visible to anyone looking out casually. When I finally left through the front entrance, he was gone, but my apartment lights were visible from where he had been standing. I called the police the next morning, bringing printed screenshots of Alexander's messages and the security footage. Officer Ryan Mills looked through everything with the patient thoroughness of someone who had dealt with stalking cases before, but his expression told me what I was afraid to hear. Nothing here is technically threatening, he explained. Weird, uncomfortable, definitely crossing boundaries, but not criminal. We can talk to him, ask him to back off, but without explicit threats or physical contact, our options are limited. Alexander stopped messaging me after the police visit, but that felt more ominous than reassuring. The sudden silence suggested he knew about law enforcement involvement, which meant he was either more connected in town than his profile suggested, or more observant than I had realized. My routine changes became more extreme. Different grocery stores in neighboring towns, varying work schedules, asking Nicole to accept packages so I would not have to interact with delivery drivers. The break-in happened on a Tuesday in November during the 3 hours I spent at a veterinary conference in Mansfield. Someone had picked the lock on my apartment door with professional precision, leaving no scratches on the metal, no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong in ways I could not initially identify. My underwear drawer had been searched, items refolded but not quite in the same positions. My bathroom cabinet showed similar signs of careful inspection. Whoever had been inside had spent time in my bedroom, possibly going through my closet, definitely handling personal items with a thoroughness that made me nauseous to contemplate. The police found no fingerprints, no evidence that would stand up in court, no proof that anyone had been inside at all. Could be you're misremembering how you left things, Officer Mills suggested gently. Stress and paranoia can make people hyper-aware of details that might normally go unnoticed. But I knew what I knew, and what I knew was that Alexander Smith or someone working with him had been inside my home. I hired a private investigator the next day, a former police detective named Sarah Cross, who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. Sarah's background check on Alexander Smith revealed information that shattered any remaining sense of safety I had in Millbrook. Alexander Smith was not a local farmer or longtime resident. Alexander Smith was not even his real name. His actual identity was Marcus Allen Walsh, and he had restraining orders filed against him in 3 different states. The Facebook profile, the helpful community posts, the entire persona of Alexander Smith had been constructed over the course of 18 months, carefully building credibility and local connections in preparation for whatever he was planning to do to me. Sarah's investigation revealed that Marcus had a pattern of targeting women who posted in small-town Facebook groups, particularly women who mentioned being new to the area or recently divorced. He researched his victims thoroughly, sometimes for months, learning their routines and vulnerabilities before making contact. The farm backdrop in his profile picture was stock photography. The helpful posts in community groups were often copied from other towns' Facebook discussions. Most terrifyingly, Marcus had not been working alone. Sarah discovered connections between his activities and at least 2 other fake Facebook profiles in the Millbrook group. The construction workers he had warned me about were actually watching me for him. The men at Murphy's Bar discussing me were reporting back to someone who was coordinating my surveillance with frightening efficiency. "You were selected," Sarah explained during our second meeting, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this pattern too many times before. New to town, recently divorced, living alone, working a job that requires predictable hours. You checked every box on their target list. The Facebook post was just confirming what they already suspected about your availability and vulnerability. The FBI arrested Marcus Allen Walsh and 2 accomplices 3 weeks later at a motel in Kentucky, where they found detailed files on 17 women across 6 states. My file was the thickest, filled with photographs taken from outside my apartment, copies of veterinary records they had somehow accessed, and a timeline of my daily activities that spanned nearly 2 months. Marcus received 15 years in federal prison. His accomplices got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, revealing a network of men who used social media to identify and hunt isolated women in small communities across the Midwest. The Millbrook Community Board Facebook group had been compromised for over a year, with multiple fake profiles gathering intelligence on potential victims. I left Millbrook 3 days after the arrests, driving straight through to Oregon where my sister lives and where I could disappear into a city large enough that anonymity felt possible again. The veterinary practice went to a colleague from veterinary school who had no idea why I was selling so cheaply or why I refused to discuss my reasons for leaving. Nicole from the bakery still sends Christmas cards, always including updates about Millbrook that I read with the fascination of someone who survived a disaster and needs to know the aftermath. The Facebook group was disbanded after the FBI investigation revealed the extent of infiltration. The clinic continues to thrive under new ownership. Life goes on for everyone who was not selected as prey. But I know now that digital communities are hunting grounds, that social media profiles can be elaborate traps, that predators study their victims with the patience and thoroughness of scientists conducting research. I know that small towns are not inherently safer than cities, just easier to monitor and control when you have the right connections and enough advanced planning. Most people join community Facebook groups to find restaurant recommendations and learn about local events. But I learned that some people join to find victims, to identify women who are alone and vulnerable, to gather intelligence for crimes that unfold over months rather than minutes. And sometimes the friendly neighbor who offers to help you settle in is actually a predator who has been preparing to destroy your life since the moment you announced your existence to his hunting ground. The investigation also revealed something that still keeps me awake at night. Marcus had been planning to escalate beyond surveillance and psychological intimidation. In his hotel room, agents found zip ties, duct tape, and a detailed map showing the route from my apartment to an abandoned farmhouse 40 miles outside Millbrook. Sarah told me later that based on similar cases, I probably had less than a week before he moved from watching to acting. I never thought working as a forest ranger would put me face to face with something that defied every natural law I understood. I was 30, stationed at the Pine Ridge Ranger Station in northern Idaho, responsible for monitoring 50,000 acres of wilderness that surrounded our tiny community of maybe 200 year-round residents. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain roads, and where the biggest excitement was usually a lost hiker or the occasional bear sighting. I had been working these forests for 6 years, knew every trail, every creek crossing, every place where cell phone service cut out completely. The job suited me perfectly after my divorce, offering solitude and purpose in equal measure. My days were spent checking campsites, maintaining trails, and educating tourists who thought a day hike required nothing more than sneakers and a water bottle. The first sign something was wrong came during my regular patrol of the Blackwater Trail in early September. I was checking the primitive campsites along the creek, making sure previous visitors had properly extinguished their fires and packed out their trash, when I noticed the stones. Someone had arranged rocks in a perfect spiral pattern about 15 feet from the established fire ring, each stone precisely placed with mathematical accuracy. Campers occasionally built unauthorized fire rings or stacked rocks as markers, but this was different. The spiral was too precise, too deliberate, and the stones had been selected for specific sizes and colors in a way that suggested knowledge of some system I did not understand. I photographed the arrangement and dismantled it, assuming it was the work of some artistic camper who did not realize they were supposed to leave no trace. But 3 days later, during my next patrol of the area, the spiral was back. Exactly the same pattern, using the same stones I had scattered, rebuilt with the same mathematical precision. This time, I left it undisturbed and set up a trail camera about 50 yards away, hidden behind a fallen log where it could monitor the area without being easily spotted. The footage from that first week showed nothing unusual during daylight hours. Hikers passed by without seeming to notice the stone arrangement. A family of deer grazed nearby one afternoon, but the night footage was different. Something moved through the frame around 2:30 a.m. on the fourth night, too quickly for the camera to capture clearly, but large enough to trigger the motion sensor. I reviewed that segment repeatedly, enhancing the image as much as possible with the equipment available at the ranger station. What I saw looked human in size and shape, but the movement was wrong. It glided between trees without disturbing branches, covered ground too quickly, and seemed to understand exactly where the camera was positioned because it remained mostly out of frame. Over the next 2 weeks, I found similar stone spirals at 3 other locations throughout my patrol area. Always in remote spots, always built with the same mathematical precision, always accompanied by other subtle signs that someone or something was moving through the forest with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Broken branches that formed directional arrows, scratched bark on trees that created crude symbols, footprints that appeared for a few yards before vanishing completely. The footprints were the most disturbing discovery. They were roughly human in size and shape, but the stride length was impossible for any person to achieve naturally. The depth and spacing suggested someone taking steps of 8 to 10 feet across uneven forest floor, something that would require superhuman strength and balance. I started carrying additional equipment during my patrols: a better camera, motion sensors, audio recording devices, anything that might help me document whatever was creating these signs. My supervisor, Benjamin, thought I was becoming paranoid about vandalism, but he supported my investigation as long as it did not interfere with regular duties. The breakthrough came during a night patrol in late September. I was checking the Whitman Creek area around midnight when I heard sounds that made my blood freeze. Footsteps moving parallel to my position, maintaining perfect pace with my movement, staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I continued, they resumed. I tried calling out, thinking it might be a lost hiker, but received no response. The footsteps continued for nearly 20 minutes, never getting closer but never falling behind, as if something was studying my movements with scientific precision. When I finally reached my vehicle and drove back to the ranger station, I felt eyes watching from the tree line until I was completely out of the forest. The next morning, I found fresh stone spirals at 2 locations I had visited during that night patrol. But these were different from the earlier arrangements. The stones were larger, the patterns more complex, and they incorporated elements that seemed specifically designed to communicate something. Small bones arranged in geometric patterns. Feathers from local birds woven into the stone arrangements. Pieces of bark carved with symbols that resembled no writing system I recognized. I contacted Dr. Sarah Martinez, an anthropologist at the University of Idaho, sending her photographs of the symbols and arrangements. Her response was immediate and alarming. The patterns matched descriptions from Native American folklore about forest entities that existed between the human and spirit worlds. Beings that served as guardians or warnings for people who ventured too deep into sacred wilderness areas. According to Dr. Martinez, several tribes in the region had legends about watchers that monitored human activity in certain forests, particularly areas where ancient burial grounds or ceremonial sites were located. The stone spirals and carved symbols were traditional methods these entities used to mark territory and communicate with humans who were sensitive enough to recognize their presence. But Dr. Martinez also mentioned something that made my situation much more serious. According to the folklore, these entities typically ignored human activity unless they perceived a threat to the forest or its sacred sites. The fact that one was actively engaging with me, creating increasingly complex arrangements and following my movements, suggested it was trying to communicate something urgent. I spent the next week researching the history of the Pine Ridge area, discovering information that the Forest Service had never included in our training materials. The entire region had been used by local tribes for centuries as a burial ground for important leaders and shamans. Several sites throughout my patrol area contained remains that were considered sacred and protected by both federal law and tribal agreements. The revelation that I had been unknowingly walking through ancient burial sites explained the Watcher's behavior. It was not threatening me directly, but trying to educate me about the significance of the areas I was responsible for protecting. The stone spirals were markers indicating sacred sites. The carved symbols were warnings about places where human activity should be limited or avoided entirely. I contacted the regional tribal council, explaining my experiences and asking for guidance on how to properly respect the sacred areas within my patrol zone. The response was swift and supportive. Tribal Elder Ryan Whitehorse agreed to meet with me and conduct a formal blessing ceremony to acknowledge my new understanding of the forest's spiritual significance. During the ceremony, conducted at sunrise near one of the stone spiral sites, Elder Whitehorse explained that the Watcher I had been encountering was likely the spirit of an ancient guardian whose responsibility was to protect the burial sites from disturbance. My willingness to learn and adapt had apparently satisfied this spirit, because the mysterious activities ceased immediately after the blessing. The stone spirals remained in place, but they stopped appearing in new locations. The footprints and carved symbols disappeared entirely. My night patrols returned to normal with only the usual sounds of wildlife and wind through the trees. but I maintained the protocols Elder Whitehorse had taught me, approaching certain areas with greater reverence and limiting tourist access to the most sensitive sites. 6 months later, I was promoted to district supervisor, partially because of my work documenting and protecting the cultural resources within the Pine Ridge area. The experience had taught me that forests contain layers of history and significance that extend far beyond what appears on topographic maps or in government databases. I still patrol the same trails, but with different eyes and deeper respect for the ancient connections between land and spirit that most people never recognize. The Watcher taught me that some things in the wilderness demand acknowledgement rather than explanation, and that the most important part of protecting natural areas is understanding their complete history, not just their biological significance. Most forest rangers monitor wildlife populations and maintain recreational facilities. But I learned that some of us are called to serve as bridges between the modern world and ancient responsibilities that predate government agencies by thousands of years. Sometimes the most important part of protecting a forest is recognizing that you are not its first guardian, just its most recent one. The stone spirals still appear occasionally, but now I understand them as gifts rather than warnings. Reminders that the forest holds wisdom older than any human institution, and that true stewardship requires humility before forces we may never fully comprehend, but must always respect. I never thought working the night shift at a truck stop diner would put me on a serial killer's target list. I was 24, waiting tables at Murphy's 24-hour diner in Millerville, Wyoming, a town of 3,400 people that sits right on Highway 47, where truckers and travelers pass through on their way between Denver and Salt Lake City. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's story, where strangers stick out immediately, and where the biggest excitement was usually someone's credit card getting declined or a trucker falling asleep in his rig. The diner was one of those classic roadside establishments that had been serving coffee and pie since the 1960s, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox that still played actual records. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., serving coffee to long-haul truckers and the occasional lost tourist who had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the vast Wyoming darkness. My routine was simple and predictable. Clock in at 10, serve truckers and insomniacs until the morning rush started around 5:30. Then walk home to my apartment on Oakwood Drive as the sun came up. It was a 15-minute walk through residential streets that were completely safe, past houses where people left their doors unlocked and kids still played in unfenced yards. The first sign something was wrong came during my second week of March, when a trucker named Alexander started asking questions that felt too personal for casual conversation. He was a regular customer, drove for a freight company out of Nebraska, and usually stopped at Murphy's twice a week on his route. But his questions had shifted from general friendliness to specific curiosity about my schedule, my living situation, and whether I walked home alone. "You shouldn't be walking by yourself at that hour," Alexander said during one of his visits, stirring sugar into his coffee with more attention than the task required. "A pretty young girl like you living alone, there are people who might take advantage of that. Dangerous people pass through here all the time." I assured him that Millerville was perfectly safe, that I had been walking home alone for months without any problems, but Alexander's concern felt manufactured in a way that made me uncomfortable. He knew too much about my routine, mentioned details about my apartment location that I had never shared with any customer. Other truckers started making similar comments. Benjamin, who drove for a different company but seemed to know Alexander, mentioned seeing me walk down Oakwood Drive and suggested that I should consider getting rides home instead of walking alone in the dark. Ryan, another regular, asked whether my family knew I was working nights and walking home by myself. The The questions felt coordinated, as if these men were sharing information about me and comparing notes about my habits and vulnerabilities. I started paying closer attention to their conversations, noticing that they often sat together when their stops at the diner coincided, and that they seemed to have detailed knowledge of Millerville's layout despite supposedly just passing through. It was during the last week of March that I realized the scope of what was happening. A trucker I had never seen before came in around 2 a.m., ordered coffee and pie, and spent over an hour asking casual questions about the area. Where did most of the young women in town live? Were there college students? Did people generally feel safe walking alone at night? When I asked him about his route, he gave vague answers about picking up loads in the area but could not name any specific businesses or destinations. His truck was parked where I could see it through the diner's front windows, and I noticed he spent a lot of time looking at a notebook writing down information between sips of coffee. I started documenting these interactions, writing down license plate numbers, descriptions of the truckers who asked unusual questions, and details about their apparent knowledge of local geography and residents. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. At least 6 different men, all claiming to be independent truckers, had been asking similar questions over the past month. The breakthrough came when I overheard part of a conversation between Alexander and Benjamin during a busy Friday night. They were discussing the girl who walks on Oakwood and mentioning specific details about my apartment building, including which unit I lived in and which direction I approached from when walking home. Most chillingly, Alexander mentioned something about the collection schedule and how I fit the profile perfectly. The conversation ended abruptly when they noticed I was within earshot, but I had heard enough to understand that my routine was being studied by multiple people who were coordinating their observations. I called the Wyoming State Police the next morning, speaking with Detective Sarah Walsh, who specialized in interstate crimes involving truckers and highway predators. She took my report seriously, particularly when I described the coordinated nature of the questioning and the detailed knowledge these men seemed to have about local women and their routines. Detective Walsh explained that law enforcement had been tracking a pattern of disappearances along truck routes throughout the Mountain West, cases where young women working night shifts or walking alone had vanished without a trace. The victims were typically between 20 and 30 years old, lived alone, and worked jobs that required predictable late-night schedules. What you're describing fits a pattern we've been investigating for over a year, Detective Walsh told me. Groups of truckers working together to identify and track potential victims in small towns along their routes. They share information, study routines, and coordinate abductions that appear random but are actually carefully planned operations. The state police set up surveillance around the diner and my apartment, monitoring the truckers who had been asking questions about me. They also installed recording equipment to document conversations between the suspected predators, hoping to gather evidence that would support federal charges for conspiracy and interstate trafficking. The arrest happened 3 weeks later when Alexander and Benjamin attempted to approach me while I was walking home from work. They had parked their truck strategically along my route, with Alexander waiting near my apartment building while Benjamin positioned himself to block my normal path, forcing me to walk past where Alexander was waiting. Plainclothes officers intervened before they could make contact with me, arresting both men and discovering evidence in their trucks that revealed the extent of their operation. They found detailed files on dozens of women throughout Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, including photographs, work schedules, and home addresses gathered during months of surveillance. The investigation expanded rapidly, revealing a trafficking network that involved 17 truckers operating across 8 states. They had been abducting women from small towns along their routes, transporting victims across state lines and selling them to buyers in major cities. The operation had been active for over 3 years, and law enforcement believes they were responsible for at least 23 disappearances. Alexander received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Benjamin and 4 other core members of the network received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. The remaining truckers received shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, but their testimonies revealed the sophisticated planning and coordination behind what had appeared to be random disappearances. I quit my job at Murphy's Diner and moved to Colorado Springs 2 months after the arrests, unable to continue living in Millerville, where I constantly worried about whether other predators might be studying my routines. The knowledge that I had been selected as a target, that my daily activities had been documented and shared among criminals planning my abduction, made it impossible to feel safe in familiar surroundings. The diner closed permanently 6 months later, unable to recover from the negative publicity surrounding the case. Highway 47 still carries truckers and travelers through Millerville, but the town installed additional street lighting and organized community watch programs to monitor suspicious activity around businesses frequented by transient workers. Detective Walsh told me that my willingness to document the suspicious behavior and report it promptly probably saved my life and prevented other abductions. The network had been planning to take me during my walk home on April 15th, exactly 2 weeks after I contacted law enforcement. My cooperation provided the evidence needed to identify and arrest the entire operation. I still work night shifts, but now in a large city where anonymity provides security and where public transportation eliminates the need to walk alone through predictable routes. The experience taught me that predators often hide behind legitimate occupations and normal appearances, and that what seems like casual conversation can actually be intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. Most people who work night shifts worry about drunk customers or difficult co-workers. But I learned that some of us are being studied by organized criminals who see our routines as opportunities and our isolation as vulnerability. Highway truck stops and late-night diners can serve as hunting grounds for predators who understand that small-town trust and predictable schedules create perfect conditions for crimes that leave few witnesses and fewer clues. The network's files revealed that they had been monitoring Murphy's Diner for over 2 years, documenting the schedules and routines of every female employee. I was their primary target, but they had backup plans involving 2 other women who worked in town. The coordinated surveillance and planning involved in their operation was more sophisticated than anything local law enforcement had encountered, requiring federal resources and interstate cooperation to fully investigate and prosecute. Millerville still feels the impact of discovering that their small town had been a hunting ground for interstate traffickers. Property values declined, several businesses closed, and many families moved away rather than continue living in a community that had been systematically stalked by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit rural isolation and small-town routines for predatory purposes. I never thought working part-time at a pharmacy would expose me to a conspiracy that connected murder to prescription fraud. I was 38. Recently divorced, trying to rebuild my life in Millerville, Colorado, after losing nearly everything in my ex-husband's investment schemes. The town felt like the perfect place to start over, small enough that people looked out for each other, but large enough that I could maintain some privacy about my past failures. Henderson's Pharmacy on Main Street was exactly what I needed after the chaos of my marriage collapsed. Clean, quiet work organizing inventory, processing insurance claims, and helping customers with routine prescriptions. The pay was modest, but it was honest work that let me sleep at night, something I had not been able to do during the final months of fighting lawyers and creditors. Dr. Anthony had been the town pharmacist for over 20 years, one of those trusted community figures who knew everyone's medical history and family secrets. People brought their prescriptions to Henderson's not just because it was convenient, but because Dr. Anthony remembered their names, asked about their children, and genuinely cared about their health and well-being. During my second week on the job, I started noticing patterns in the prescription orders that seemed unusual for a small-town pharmacy. Large quantities of pain medication being ordered for patients I knew had died months earlier. Expensive drugs prescribed to people who, according to local knowledge, had never been seriously ill. Prescription bottles being prepared for pickup but never collected, accumulating in storage bins behind the counter. When I mentioned these observations to Dr. Anthony, his response was immediate and defensive. "Patient privacy is sacred," he told me, his voice carrying an edge I had never heard before. "We cannot discuss individual prescriptions or make assumptions about what people need. Our job is to fill what doctors prescribe, not to question medical decisions." His reaction felt disproportionate to what had been casual observations about workflow efficiency, but I attributed it to professional caution and my own inexperience in pharmacy operations. I focused on learning my duties and avoiding further questions about prescription patterns that were probably normal but unfamiliar to someone new to the business. It was during my third week that I discovered the storage room in the basement that Dr. Anthony had told me was for old records and equipment. While looking for inventory supplies, I found boxes of prescription medications that had supposedly been dispensed to customers but were clearly still in the pharmacy's possession. Thousands of pills, bottles still sealed, representing tens of thousands of dollars in medications that insurance companies had paid for but patients had never received. The medications were primarily pain management drugs, anxiety medications, and other controlled substances that had high street value. The quantities were staggering, suggesting systematic fraud over months or years rather than isolated incidents of unclaimed prescriptions. I photographed several boxes before leaving the storage room, uncertain about what I had discovered, but knowing it represented something serious enough to require documentation. That evening, I researched prescription fraud, learning about the connection between illegally diverted medications and both organized crime and individual dealers who supplied black market drug operations. The next morning, Dr. Anthony called me into his office, his demeanor completely different from the friendly employer I had come to know. "Someone has been in the storage room without authorization," he said, watching my reaction carefully. "That area contains confidential patient records and is off limits to all staff except myself." I assured him I had only been looking for inventory supplies, but his expression remained hostile and suspicious. "Patient privacy violations are federal crimes," he continued. "People who compromise medical confidentiality can face serious legal consequences, including criminal charges that would make it impossible to find employment in healthcare or other professional fields." The threat was clear, even though it was couched in language about regulatory compliance. Dr. Anthony was warning me to stay away from the storage room and to keep quiet about anything I might have seen. But his reaction confirmed that what I had discovered was significant enough to justify intimidation. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to the pharmacy's operations, documenting discrepancies between prescription orders, insurance billing, and actual dispensing. The pattern that emerged was systematic fraud involving fake prescriptions, billing for medications never delivered to patients, and diversion of controlled substances for illegal distribution. Dr. Anthony was working with someone to generate fraudulent prescriptions using the names and insurance information of deceased patients and people who had moved away from the area. The medications were being billed to insurance companies and government programs, but instead of being dispensed to patients, they were being accumulated for resale on the black market. But the operation was more complex than simple prescription fraud. I discovered that some of the fake prescriptions were being written for people who had died under suspicious circumstances. Individuals whose deaths had been explained as natural causes or accidents. but who had been in good health before their sudden passing. Among the names on fraudulent prescriptions, I recognized several people who had died within the past 2 years. Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman who had supposedly died of heart failure but had been active and healthy just weeks before her death. Robert Jenkins, a middle-aged farmer who had allegedly died in a farming accident but whose injuries, according to local gossip, had been inconsistent with the official explanation. The realization that Dr. Anthony might be connected to suspicious deaths in addition to prescription fraud made my situation much more dangerous. If he was willing to commit murder to maintain his fraudulent operation, my knowledge of his activities put me at serious risk. I contacted the Drug Enforcement Administration, speaking with Agent Benjamin Martinez, who specialized in prescription fraud and pharmaceutical diversion cases. Agent Martinez took my report seriously, particularly when I described the connections between fraudulent prescriptions and recent deaths in the community. What you're describing could be part of a systematic operation involving both fraud and homicide, Agent Martinez explained. Pharmacists who kill patients to maintain fraudulent prescriptions represent one of the most dangerous types of healthcare fraud, because they have both the means and the access necessary to commit murders that appear natural. The DEA launched an investigation, installing surveillance equipment in the pharmacy and monitoring Dr. Anthony's communications and financial transactions. They also began reviewing the medical records and death certificates of people whose names had been used for fraudulent prescriptions, looking for evidence of homicide disguised as natural death. The breakthrough came when forensic pathologists exhumed the bodies of 3 people whose names appeared on fraudulent prescriptions written after their deaths. Toxicology analysis revealed lethal doses of medications that Dr. Anthony had access to through his pharmacy. Drugs that would cause symptoms resembling heart failure or other natural causes of death. Dr. Anthony was arrested at the pharmacy during normal business hours, an event that shocked the entire community. People who had trusted him with their most intimate health information discovered that he had been systematically defrauding insurance programs, diverting controlled substances, and murdering patients who might have exposed his crimes. The investigation expanded to include law enforcement officers who had failed to properly investigate suspicious deaths, medical examiners who had signed death certificates without adequate examination, and insurance investigators who had ignored patterns of fraud. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of the healthcare and legal systems, all working to protect a murderous pharmacist. Dr. Anthony confessed to 7 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though investigators believe the actual number of victims was much higher. He had been killing patients who asked too many questions about their medications, who noticed discrepancies in their prescriptions, or who threatened to report irregularities to authorities. The pharmacy closed permanently after Dr. Anthony's arrest, leaving the community without convenient access to prescription medications. Many residents had to drive 40 miles to the nearest town for prescriptions, a hardship that particularly affected elderly and disabled people who had depended on Henderson's pharmacy for decades. I moved to Denver 3 months after the arrests, unable to continue living in a community where I had unknowingly worked for a serial killer who had used prescription fraud to cover his murders. The knowledge that I had been processing fake prescriptions for dead patients, some of whom Dr. Anthony had killed personally, made it impossible to feel comfortable in Millerville. The experience taught me that healthcare fraud often masks more serious crimes and that people in trusted positions can exploit that trust to commit murder with impunity for years before being discovered. Dr. Anthony had killed 7 people, stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and corrupted multiple systems designed to protect public health, all while maintaining the facade of a caring small-town pharmacist. Agent Martinez told me that my decision to document the suspicious patterns and report them promptly prevented additional murders and exposed a conspiracy that might have continued for years. Dr. Anthony had been planning to expand his operation, recruiting other pharmacists in neighboring towns to participate in the fraud and murder scheme. Most people trust their pharmacists to provide medications safely and legally. But I learned that some healthcare providers use their professional credentials to commit sophisticated crimes that exploit both insurance systems and patient trust. The prescription medications that are supposed to heal can become tools for fraud, theft, and murder when dispensed by someone who values profit over human life.